chapter 11, Hebrews chapter 11, and we'll read it from verse 32. It says, And what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Amen. So far, may the Lord just bless that reading to our hearts. We saw last time that the writer, having up to this point given us specific examples of faith from the life of different individuals in the Old Testament, he then admits that he doesn't have time to keep on doing that. And so he then lists 6 specific men and the prophets, and then goes on in a general way from verses 33 through to 35 to tell us about the achievements of their faith. And we looked last time at those achievements and exploits of their faith. We saw that there were 10 positive things that he lists there from verses 33 through to verse 35. And as you look at that list there, those 10 positive things, there's a note of triumph and victory about them. The impression would almost be given that the life of faith is always a bed of roses, that it's always a spiritual high and always living victoriously and living triumphantly. So just in case we're tempted to think that, the writer brings us down to earth, as it were, and back to reality, and shows us that sometimes in the life of faith there are trials, there are difficulties, there are pressures that we will face, very trying circumstances. And he lists here 8 negative things that people of faith experienced from verses 35 through to verse 38. And they experienced these things because of their faith. They weren't just things that they experienced in life in general, but they faced these things because of their faith. So bear that in mind as we go through this list here tonight. These things were like a trial to their faith, like a testing to their faith. So those 8 things, let's look at them one by one briefly here. It says in verse 35 that some were tortured, not accepting deliverance. They were tortured, not accepting deliverance. Now, what does the writer mean here by them being tortured? He's referring to a method of torture where someone was placed on they were kind of like fastened to a device, and then there was like a wrench that was turned that caused their joints all to be dislocated out and pulled out of their sockets. This was a method of torture that was used not only in Old Testament times, but it was actually used by the Romanists against Protestants at one point to try and force them to recant their faith. And their faith was severely tested by this means of being tortured. But we're told here that they did not accept deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Deliverance, in other words, was offered to them at the price of renouncing their faith. They were told that if they would renounce their faith, that they would be delivered from this method of torture. You read the stories of the lives of the martyrs of the faith, and very often you will find that some of them were already tied to the stake where they were going to be burned. Others were about to be thrown to the lions, and more often than not, they were given a last chance to recant, to deny their faith, and to be delivered. And they will be spared from whatever means of death or whatever form they were trying to kill them by. But we're told here that these men and women of faith did not accept deliverance. They chose to suffer rather than deny Christ. You see, the real test for these believers was, what did they think more highly of and consider more important? The present comfort of their bodies or the eternal interests of their souls? That was the choice that they were faced with, really. And what did they consider more important? Being delivered from a means of torture on their bodies and being killed or whatever, or choosing the eternal interests of their souls? And don't forget that anyone who ever experienced physical torture, no matter what form that took, they had a body of flesh and bones just like we have. A body that was sensitive to pain. They felt pain no less than we do, and so pain and suffering was as real to them as it is to us whenever they were facing these things. But you see, the people who are being referred to here were so focused on their souls and on their eternal interests and the future resurrection that they were enabled to endure those physical tortures in their present bodies. The hope of the resurrection morning, that morning when their bodies would be raised and be made perfect and be glorified like Christ's body, the very thought of that is what enabled them to face these sufferings and enable them to not accept deliverance by renouncing their faith. And you read the stories even of some of the last words of some of these great martyrs as they were being burned at the stake. Very often they expressed a great hope in the future resurrection. And it was that thought that one day, even though their bodies were being tortured and put to death, the great hope that one day that their bodies would be raised again and would be glorified like Christ. It was that great hope that enabled them to endure the sufferings that they did. They did not accept deliverance, we're told, that they might obtain a better resurrection. You know, most of us will probably never be physically tortured like these people were. But the lesson that we can learn from this is, do we think more highly of and consider more important the eternal interest of our souls than the present comfort of our bodies? Do we sacrifice in any way for the cause of Christ? Do we give up a night in the house to come to the prayer meeting or to serve the Lord in some other way? What is more important to us? That's the challenge that comes to us from this. What is more important to us? Our present comforts or the eternal interests of our souls? Doing something, serving the Lord in some way. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is we're told that others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings. God's faithful people have always had to endure mockings and sneers and insults and unkind words, and probably most of us here at some point in our lives have experienced those things because of our faith. Just unkind things being said about us, perhaps sneers or whatever. Galatians 4:29 it says, "But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now." The reality is, folks, that human nature hasn't changed, and neither has Satan or the world. With all of the passing centuries of time, none of these things have changed. Human nature, Satan, the world, they're always against us, just like they were against the people of God back then. They're always against us, and right to the end of time they will. And the reality is that the more Christ-like we are, the more we will experience the mockings of the world, just like Christ did. A.W. Pink says, if we are not being mocked, sneered at, scoffed at, it is because we are too lax in our ways and too worldly in our walk. And it says here, and scourgings, in verse 36, these scourgings are referring to lashings on the back with a whip that was made of wire. It was very painful as it tore the flesh and drew blood from the body. Scourgings were usually reserved for the lowest of criminals, so it was very humiliating. And of course, that is how Christ's enemies treated him. They scourged him with a whip and humiliated him in that way. Now again, most of us will probably never be literally lashed with a whip. But there is such a thing as being lashed with the tongue. And we all know how cruel the tongue can be. And we can be lashed with the tongue as cruel and unkind things are said about us. When this happens, folks, if it happens because we belong to Christ, because we are Christians, people lash at us with their tongues and say unkind things about us, far from it discouraging us, it should actually cause us to rejoice that we are being made partakers of Christ's sufferings, that we're made to share in even a little way in the sufferings of Christ. We face those things, remember, because we belong to him. So next time somebody sneers at you or says something unkind about you because you are a Christian, remember, you're facing that because you belong to Christ. And so you should rejoice in it. The third thing then is, we're told that others had bonds and imprisonment in verse 36. Bonds and imprisonment. Bonds here is referring to God's faithful people being bound in chains and fetters so that they couldn't run away or escape. And it was very humiliating treatment again. Whenever we read the stories of believers experiencing such things, we are inclined to pity them, and rightly so. But when we think of bonds and being bound, there's something that is a form of being bound that is much more serious than someone being literally bound with chains or fetters or something else. And that is, we can be bound by sinful habits, things that we can't break or free ourselves from. And we look around us in the world, we see so many who are bound by sinful habits that they can't give up. And even as Christians, there can be things in our lives that bind us spiritually, things that hold us back from knowing God and enjoying God's best for our lives, things that are holding us back and limiting us spiritually. Perhaps it's unforgiveness towards someone, or maybe a secret addiction that no one else knows anything about, or a spirit of envy or jealousy. There are so many things that, if we examine our lives, that can be hindering us from going on with God and being what God wants us to be. And we need to be careful about those things. And it also talks here about imprisonments. Many believers have been imprisoned for their faith over the years and over the centuries. And even today, in certain parts of the world, there are still Christians that are being put in prison for their faith, literally. And remember, the prisons that the writer would have been referring to here were not like our modern day prisons, where some of them are more like hotels than prisons. And when we think of the reality of what those prisons would have been like for these believers who were put in there for their faith, nothing but real faith in God could have enabled them to endure those sufferings that they would have faced there in those prisons. And then fourth thing here says that others were stoned, beginning of verse 37. Now, stoning was a form of death that was appointed by God himself for severe offenders, and we have references to that in the book of Leviticus and Joshua, the people being stoned to death for some serious offence. It was actually appointed by God himself as a form of punishing severe offenders. And so whenever believers were stoned to death for their faith, such as Stephen, the first Christian martyr. What was happening was Satan was taking something that God himself had ordained for punishing evil doing, and Satan twisted and perverted that and used it as a means of persecuting the people of God. John Owen, the great Puritan, said, "The devil is never more a devil nor more outrageous than when he gets a pretense of God's weapons into his own hands." And how the devil loves to do that. He loves to take what God has ordained for punishing evil and using it to persecute the true people of God and to make God's people suffer. Then fifthly, it says others were sawn asunder, sawn in two. Now this was a barbaric method of execution, to literally cut someone in two. Now there are no references in the scripture itself or examples of that happening, or of anyone being put to death in this way, but tradition does tell us that the prophet Isaiah faced his death in that way, being literally sawn in two. But the fact that the writer mentions it here is proof that it did happen to some of God's people. It was a brutal form of persecution. For someone to endure such brutality and the reality of being literally sawn in two, and to still remain faithful to God in the face of that, folks, that is proof positive of the enabling of the Spirit's power to support and uphold someone who is going through that, to enable them to remain true to the Lord in the face of such indescribable agonies. This should be a challenge to us tonight, to endure patiently the smaller and less severe trials that we have to face for our faith. If others face things like this, being literally sawn in two, then and they were faithful to God in the face of that, then surely the lesser things that we have to experience, surely we can face them and still stand true to the Lord. And then sixthly, it says others were tempted. This is referring to the temptation to live a life of ease and pleasure, the type of life that worldly riches provide. This is always a temptation to every one of us. It's something we all battle with, isn't it? The temptation to live a life of ease and pleasure. And it's always a temptation to us to choose that rather than sacrificing and suffering for Christ and for his cause. You know, history tells us that during the reign of Bloody Mary back in the 17th century, that some of those who had courageously endured long and sometimes cruel imprisonment, yet whenever Queen Elizabeth came to the throne then, and these people were freed from that imprisonment, and some of them were given high positions of great wealth and power, we're told that many of them became lukewarm in their faith and in their zeal for the Lord. They gave in to the temptation to a life of ease and affluence, and the Lord took second place. And that's remarkable, isn't it, to think that people could endure great suffering, great physical afflictions, and yet when the temptation came to have a life of ease, that temptation was stronger for them than being physically tortured, perhaps in a prison. And we must always beware of that temptation in our lives. And seventhly, we're told that others were slain by the sword. This literally reads, they died in the slaughter of the sword. And this is referring to the multitude of martyrs who sealed their testimony by their blood. Revelation 17 and verse 6, it talks about the war Babylon being drunk with the blood of the saints. The world tonight hates us with a vengeance. They really do. Some of them may be nice to us and to our faces, but the reality is what we stand for, they hate. And we can always expect to face the hatred of the world in some way. Cruel massacres of Christians have always taken place throughout history and are still taking place in parts of the world tonight. And I believe if they only had the opportunity, they would do it here in our own nation. Then eighthly, the eighth thing here, we're told in verse 37 that others wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented. This is referring to God's people who were at times hounded out of their own homes and were just forced to go and exist without any permanent place to stay. They just had to wear clothes that were made from the skins of animals as opposed to clothes that were woven by man. Some of them were forced to live in desolate places in the mountains and in caves and dens of wild beasts. Someone has said, "What a commentary upon fallen human nature. These saints of God were safer among the beasts of the field than in the religious world inflamed by the devil." And then it goes on to say that they were being destitute, afflicted, tormented. They were deprived, some of them, of the ordinary necessities of life. Some of them were deprived of even the help of relatives and friends. They were afflicted in their minds. They felt their miserable condition. They were ill-treated by strangers that they met in their wanderings. E.M. Bounds says, "Any day, any one of these wanderers could have rejoined their fellow men, enjoyed their society, and shared their comforts, but they preferred this lot to apostasy." Later adds a comment here, "of whom the world was not worthy," beginning of verse 38 there, "of whom the world was not worthy." And that's a remarkable little statement there. This shows us God's estimation of these believers. The world's estimation was the world's estimation of these believers was just throw them out of their homes, just let them wander around as homeless wanderers. But God's estimation of these people of faith was that they were such a noble people that the world wasn't even worthy to have them live amongst them. You know, no matter what the world might do to us, no matter how the world might treat us tonight for our faith, remember, God's estimate of us as his people is, as Psalm 16:3 says, "We are the saints that are in the earth, and the excellent in whom is all his delight." Folks, that's how God sees us tonight. Here we are, a little group of believers coming together here to pray tonight. If the world could just see us tonight, they would laugh at us for doing this. And yet, as God looks at us, God's estimation of us is that we are the excellent in whom is all his delight. For us to live a life of faith and honour God in the face of all that the world would throw at us, folks, it is to bring pleasure and delight to the heart of God. And may God enable us and encourage us, as by faith alone we are enabled to face all of these things that the world would throw at us, all of these different forms of persecution. May God strengthen our faith that we might stand strong against the hatred of the world, and that we might stand strong as bright and shining lights for him. So trust those few thoughts will be an encouragement to your heart, and that the Lord will enable us all, no matter what comes our way, no matter what difficulties we may have to face for our faith, that the Lord will enable us all to stand strong and following the example of those who have went before us and who are willing to suffer for the sake of Christ.